Hello and welcome! I think everyone has their favorite genre or style of games that they like to play. From racing games to button mashers to the long drawn out strategy games which can literally last days. For me, I am personally a fan of the quick pick up and play style of action games, from Mario or Zelda to Spyro and Infamous. However, if you were to take a look at my shelf of portable games, you'll find that one game franchise in particular sticks out like a sore thumb in comparison to the slog of action, license, or even racing games. Pokemon. Pokemon is one of the few strategy games that I actually enjoy. And recently, I've gotten a bit nostalgic for the first few games that I've played of it. So join me as I stroll down memory lane and take a look back at my first two Pokemon games. Today's video is brought to you by us at 16-Bit Virtual Studios. I'm excited to announce today that we have new products available here on the 16-Bit store. From the Game Boy cartridge dust covers and display stands, to a Sega Game Gear display stand and kit, to the return of our Game Boy storage shells of various cartridge capacities. You can find all these products and more available now on our eBay and Etsy stores. And if you use our offer code 16-Bit Review at checkout, you'll receive 15% off your next order if you order 2 or more items. When it comes to my first interactions with Pokemon, there are 3 things which I remember about it: the cards, the anime, and pinball. Pokemon has always existed for me in one form or another, but despite having a Game Boy Color during its surge in popularity, I actually missed out on the first 2 waves of Pokemon games, and it wouldn't be until the long game drought between Gens 3 and Gen 4 when I finally got properly acquainted with the series. During that period of time, I used to play Game Boy with my school friends, and they all had their Game Boy Advance copies of Pokemon and were battling and trading with each other and trying to figure out where all the cool secrets are within the world, with the lone exception of me just playing Mario, Zelda, or Metroid instead. I tried to fit in the best I can with this mysterious copy of Pokemon Pinball Advance, which I'm actually not that sure of where I got this game. But even with a Pokemon game on hand, suddenly I never felt like I could just join in the conversation, since I wasn't really playing anything resembling what my friends were. So I made it a mission to find myself a copy of Pokemon. Somehow. Problem was, I was a kid with no income in the mid-2000s and no internet or knowledge of used games. However, I was saved with a local rental store when they were still a thing. And alongside the rented DVDs and VHS tapes, they also sold used video games. And in between these odd-looking fat PlayStations that didn't look anything like my PlayStation, I found a used copy of Pokemon. And being a game with the word Pokemon in the title, I instantly begged my mom to get it for me. So my first Pokemon game during the height of Ruby and Sapphire, Leaf Green and Fire Red was Pokemon Blue, which cost me a whopping $10. And to say I was excited would be an understatement. Unfortunately, booting up the game now and starting a fresh game doesn't really bring up much memories of what it was like for me starting the game for the first time, unlike my other Pokemon games. What I can remember was being confused with how to actually start the game, wanting just to catch a Pokemon and get going with it, like all of my other games where you just got your sword and got swinging and found your way to dungeons. I think it was my friend Daniel who suggested that I should just go find a Pokemon store so I can buy Pokemons, and enticed me with a deal that if I buy 10 Pokeballs, I can get a free Premier Ball. So off I was to find Pokemon and catch my first Pokemon, since they didn't give me one when I started. Then I accidentally stumbled into some old dude and, well, the game actually started. I later learned that the 10 Pokeball thing only really existed with the Game Boy Advance games and later. It pains me that I can't remember who my first starter was in Pokemon Blue. I have a feeling that it might have been Squirtle, since it was the same as the box Pokemon, but I might have picked Charmander since I was familiar with it, and Ash's Charizard looked cool. But no matter what my first starter was, it didn't really matter, since on my bus ride home, when I turned the game on after recess, I learned that the save battery inside this game was dead. And my first Pokemon was also dead. And all the progress that I made at school was long gone. Since I was a dumb kid in the mid-2000s with no internet, this was how I played Pokemon for like a couple of months. No way to save my game, just trying to brute force my way into understanding strategy and how the mechanics work, all before I ran out of batteries and had to turn the system off. To say that my progress in Blue was slow would be an understatement. Outside of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets for the Game Boy Color, I had really no other strategy games to play, and Harry didn't really explain how to play these games. But eventually, through painstaking trial and error, progress was made. Eventually, I settled on picking Bulbasaur as my starter, since at some point I was able to make it through Mount Moon, and learned that if I was to have any hope in heck at beating Misty, I needed a grass type. And after time, I was able to beat her too, and make my way all the way to Lieutenant Surge. But at that point, I had enough. And I was able to annoy my dad enough to help me figure out how to open the cartridge up and figure out how to take the battery out, and eventually he observed me hot gluing a fresh one in its place. So now my game actually saves. And finally, with the ability to save my game under my belt, I can finally change focus to actually completing my game. Just in time for my annual out-of-province vacation to see my extended family, where coincidentally I actually got this little Squirtle from a little claw machine. It's one of the first things I've won out of a claw machine, at least deliberately. In its honor, and realizing that ice attacks are super effective against grass-type Pokemon, and Gary's primary Pokemon was grass-type, I started using Squirtle as my main starter. And as my vacation was coming to a close, I remember sitting in bed as dusk was slowly dwindling what little light I could see on this screen, sweating buckets of heat in my grandparents' poorly air-conditioned house. I finally took on the Elite Four, and spamming Hyper Potions and Revive, claimed my victory. It took many Hyper Potion Revives and a lot of my money that I did not spend in the Rocket Casino. Seriously, the Pokemon series taught me a valuable lesson to say it's far away from real casinos as humanly possible, since even nowadays I still don't have the impulse control. But that was the first Pokemon game that I ever completed. Even though Pokemon was nothing that I had ever experienced before, and it really was outside of my comfort zone at the time, I did find it rather enjoyable to play. the world was the biggest draw for how big and expansive it is, just for how much there is to see and to do in it outside of, battling. I just wish that this game had more to it, or, just add color. I just wish I had more Pokemon. Now, either during this trip, or perhaps it might have been next year's, my grandmother took me to a comic book store, which also happened to sell used games at the time. I think they stopped doing it after a point. Somehow, during that trip, I also found another Pokemon game. It was $15, and it looked nothing like my current game, so I knew it was a new game in the series. And the Pokemon on the cart looked nothing like the versions that I was used to. I didn't know which game it was at the time, but I knew with what cash I had on hand and the tuning that was in her back seat, I could get it. And after much persuasion, she let me. And it just so happened that it was the second Pokemon game in the series, Pokemon Silver. I excitedly waited to get back to my grandma's house and raced to my Game Boy Advance to try it out. So I turned the game on, made my way to Professor Elm, and I couldn't quite figure out which starter I wanted, so I talked to my grandfather to ask him, hey, which one of these three look cool? And he had no opinion, so I ended up with Cyndaquil, and I was immediately reminded of the pain that I went through with Pokemon Blue. So I saved my game to see if this game's battery was dead too. And sadly, it was. But thankfully, my vacation was at an end at the time, and when I got home, I was able to pop the game open, swap the battery out like I did last time, and I was able to fix it myself. So unlike Pokemon Blue, where I spent most of my time hitting walls, just having to restart the journey endlessly, this time I was actually able to take my time in Johto and enjoy the sights. It's probably the reason why I actually prefer Pokemon Silver to Pokemon Blue. At the core of it, Pokemon's Blue and Silver are the same games in terms of how you play and interact with it. You just walk around some grass, battle some Pokemon and or trainers, get some gym badges to progress and to get moves so that you can unlock roadblocks, and so on and so forth. Until you're the best that ever was and the game says, go and get them all. The biggest and most notable difference on paper with this game, for everyone who cared about it, was the fact that the game was now in color. There was new typings that better balanced the game and the mechanics with the battling the stuff. But look, when I got this game, I was like 10, and I didn't care about any of that. Who cared about steel and dark typing? All I cared about was trying to find and figure out where to catch the best bird Pokemon that I knew of. Murkrow, because I had a card of it at the time. I wanted to explore each city as I went through it, find out which trainers I could fight and avoid, and maybe even, get some new Pokemon. And oh my gosh, I've never seen this thing before on this route. I want to catch it. That was the mentality I had while playing this game, and I was completely oblivious to the fact that it's just a well-themed dungeon crawler. I mean, I've played lots of games like this since, and typically I find games like it, a la a Final Fantasy or a Dragon Quest, to be just a boring slog of random encounters in between the bits that I want to play and the cities that I have to travel in between to do so. But with Pokemon, I found that what I would typically avoid doing in a Chrono Trigger, was a whirl of excitement in Pokemon. I was always excited to see which new Pokemon I can find, or perhaps how to navigate a route without fighting all the trainers in it, because I wasn't very good at it. And each time I re-entered an older area, it was a different experience for me. Sometimes when I went back, I was looking for a new Pokemon to catch that I saw another trainer have. Other times, I might have been just looking for new Pokemon to find by either rebattling the trainers that I missed out on, or perhaps just trying to get some more money so I can buy that Porygon at the Rocket Game Corner. Nowadays, I feel that Pokemon Blue is just a little more obvious to its dungeon crawling routes, especially with Victory Road and the layers of the 3 bird Pokemons and Mewtwo. They were really slogs for me back in the day, but I never really felt that Pokemon was a dungeon crawler back then. And while Pokemon Blue laid out a phenomenal groundwork that the future of Pokemon can build upon, Pokemon Silver just did it so much better. I love how much more there is to see, how much more there is to do, how they managed to cram an additional 100 Pokemon in the same cartridge style. There's day and night and just so much to do and to see. Plus, when you're done and you beat the Elite Four, you have the entirety of Kanto to explore, too. There is a reason why, out of all the original Pokemon games, Pokemon Silver is my favorite. However, once I got my hands on the Game Boy Advance Pokemon games, I found it difficult to go back and replay Pokemon's Blue and Silver. Every once in a while, I did grow nostalgic for these games. But I think an inherent flaw of the Pokemon series is once you've explored every last nook and cranny of the world, it turns from a exploration RPG to a social game which involves battling and trading. And battling and trading in Pokemon, especially on the Game Boy, is difficult unless you have this squid of a link cable that does both the original fat Game Boy and the slimmer Pocket Color and Advanced systems. I never really could trade with anyone of these games. They've always been a solo single-player experience, at least until recently. And even then, I still prefer the much faster, more fluid Advance and DS titles. But that being said, it doesn't mean that they aren't good Pokemon games. They are the foundation of the entire series. And due to that actually lack of popularity, it does mean that they're still reasonably priced even to this day. So if you haven't started a Pokemon game and you're looking to get into a series, these aren't a bad starting point. But with that said, you are better off with newer games. At least, unless you're nostalgic for it like myself. But anyways, thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you have yourself a good day, and as always, take care.